Okay. So I think we got about this far so far. We'll start today off with, again, it's chapter 2 in the book. And by the way, in a couple of weeks, I don't know the exact day of it. I have some traveling for work to do, so I'm not going to be here on Sunday. But we'll have class, and I'll have somebody, maybe Andrew can do it. I have a video, it's a hour-long video by Craig Hazen on basically a 1 hour, 45-minute video on just kind of the evidence for the resurrection. So it'll be a nice little change. So even though I won't be around for class, we'll still have class. That way it's easier for you. You don't have to remember anything. You just show up and it's the same old type of thing. So in the second part of the book, or the second chapter of the book, what he wants to what he wants to make sure that we understand is the rules of historical investigation, right? So when we look at anything from a historical point of view, every other document in history, when we look at those things, how do historians deal with competing claims in ancient history as to what really happened? What really happened with Julius Caesar on this day? Because this one historian says this and the other historian says that, right? So when you read your history book, it says Julius Caesar did X. And it doesn't really tell you, well, you know, there's all these other questions that we have back here. They just write it as if this is a fact and this is just the way it is. But they have some principles, and they're good principles to use as to how they determine whether or not something is truthful or not. Things like, you know, even in America, sometimes we believe, you know, stories about maybe like George Washington, about him cutting down the cherry tree or something like that, right? So what do we have historically that proves that event actually happened, or did it not happen, or why was that event invented or something like that if it is fake? So the same types of questions they ask here. So rather than give you the whole history of how they deal with history, we're just going to talk about some things that add credibility to stories. So if you read a story in the past, what are some things that you would look at and you'd say, that must be true, because if it wasn't true, they probably wouldn't have reported it. So what are some, yes?
How many people talk about it?
Yes. All right. So how many people talk about it, right? So is it limited to only one account, or is there a number of accounts? That's one. Yes, that's a great one. Anyone have any other ones that you could think of? So the number of people we have? We're talking about history, so what would be another one that you would think of?
Artifacts.
Yeah, okay. So is there any archaeological evidence that supports that claim, right? So if the claim is that they went down here and they went around the corner and there's, you know, a big mountain there and that's where this happened. Well, if you look on a map and it doesn't exist, you'd be like, well, right, it's not telling us truthful things, because it says something exists there and there's nothing that exists there. Anything else? So we have historical evidence, the number of people talking about it. Any ideas? You would find it more credible. So here's a good example. If I wrote about George Washington, would you consider it as credible as somebody who lived with George Washington? Right? So it's how close it was to the actual event, right? So the closer it is to the event, the more likely we are to accept it, right? And that doesn't always necessarily mean that it's true. It just makes it more likely, right? Because anyways, we'll talk about that later. Sometimes issues come up saying that this is the oldest account of something, but we know it's inaccurate because we found out something else, because archaeological evidence says that's not the case, and other stories that must have got from other sources at the time are telling us that this is the way it was, and all the evidence points that direction. Anything else?
So by that, did you mean witness testimony or witness
right.
accounts?
Right, so there's another one.
There at the time?
Right, so eyewitness accounts, that's another one, right? So we would be more inclined to listen to somebody who actually heard the words of Christ than somebody who didn't hear the words of Christ, right?
And the number of people that relate that account,
right.
those words.
Right.
The more there are, the more credible I think it becomes.
Right. So if you have 50 people and all 50 people say that Jesus said X, Well, you're pretty certain that he probably did say that, right? I mean, for him not to say it, how did 50 people that were eyewitnesses all come up with it? That doesn't make any sense, right? Yeah.
A great example today is Bill Cosby. If you had one accuser, that would be one thing. That could be probably distributed in a variety of ways, but when you have 39, 40 women coming forward, it kind of becomes overwhelming.
Yes, it does, and especially if they have independent testimony to the same type of thing happened to them, and yeah, exactly. So I guess Bill Cosby is a good example.
Where would you find the sources of these 50 people? Is somebody written down?
Right.
Is it individual written testimonies? Or?
It depends upon how you do it. We'll talk about the Gospels and how the Gospels fit into this. Because some of the Gospels, like the Gospel of Mark was a scribe for Peter and was writing down what Peter was talking about. So it's not the eyewitness that wrote it down, but it's the eyewitness's testimony and somebody else wrote it down for them. And that's the same as being, for all intent and purpose, eyewitness testimony.
A lot of people will see something happen, but they're not going home and writing down what they saw.
Right.
Nobody's going to them and interviewing them 500 different interviews.
Right.
Just trying to piece together.
Well, you'll find out, when we talk a little bit about the Gospels, you'll find out that in the old days, in ancient times, because there would be scribes that would be there that would take down notes sometimes. Sometimes when they weren't there, what you would find is that, and you'll see this kind of hinted at in the Gospels in a couple different places, especially if you read a parallel account of it, you'll see it in a number of different places, that Jesus will repeat himself. So when he gave the Sermon on the Mount, he probably gave it more than once. And so multiple people heard it multiple times, and that's repetition. That's how we remember things. So in the old days, if it wasn't written down, they would have said things multiple times. And that's just the way that they normally would have conducted business. They would have done things multiple times, especially if they didn't have a scribe there. And so Jesus, when he was around for 3 years, really, if you take all of Jesus' words, you have, a couple hours of him talking? If you look at it. But he was doing it for 3 years. He was probably retelling the same message over and over and over in all these different places, right? The gospel accounts are not giving us, this is what he did on day 1. He talked about this, this, and this. Day 2, he talked about this, this, and this. They're taking those same themes that he said over and over and over again, and they're putting them into spots. Now, there's obviously times when Jesus said something that was particular to the location that he was at. And those ones are probably ones to pay attention to. Like when he says, the gates of hell shall not prevail. He's sitting at a place that was called the gates of hell. There's a place there, and that,
I've been there.
yeah. So that makes more sense that it was in that context, and the gospel writers put it in there because that was related to it. And we learn more about it when we know the surroundings of what was happening. So that's important. So just to go over it, we kind of talked about all these things, but the parts that they bring up. Now, Mike Licona is a historian, and his job is that's what he does. He's a historian. So he's telling us, if I want to find out if something is credible in the past, the things that I look for are, the first thing here is the multiple independent sources, which is kind of what you're talking about. But also independent, meaning there were people that were on Jesus' side and people that weren't on Jesus' side. So that's people that are biased and people that are for it, right? Then we have enemy attestation. That would be the people against the Christians. So anytime you have something where somebody who has no vested interest in telling the story says something about it, then it's more likely to be true, right? Because if I'm against you, I would just leave that out if I didn't want it to be true, right? You know, if I didn't believe in Jesus and I was a Pharisee back then, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, that Jesus guy, he said these things. Because that would be kind of like egg on my face, right? I'm now supporting the claim, right? How about embarrassing admissions? Things that are embarrassing. Now, if you're going to write your autobiography, because I was looking at a couple autobiographies like Benjamin Franklin's and stuff like that. If you're writing an autobiography, you're gonna put yourself out in the best possible light, right? Are you going to write about all those embarrassing times that you had? And if you do write about an embarrassing time and you learn something from it, you might write that down. But you're always going to have a positive spin on it. If you're writing something in ancient history, in fact, if you look at like Tacitus or Suetonius or the other Roman historians at the time, When they're writing, you can tell what emperor they're writing for, because it's marked different tone, right? When you're writing for the current sitting Caesar, all of a sudden you're talking about what a great Caesar he is, and you're kind of smoothing over all the bad parts. But when you talk about the other Caesars, you want to show that this guy is better than the other ones that you're talking about. And so you'll see in their histories, when they're writing about the other ones, they will just go over the top with how bad these other guys were. So, and then they may include some of those embarrassing things that those other Caesars had done or whatever it is. But generally they will admit those for the current sitting one, the one who is paying them to write the story or whatever it is. Right? Eyewitness testimony. Now, if somebody wrote, here's the funny thing, and this is one of the things, I keep on bringing it up only because in historian circles there's a question, did Caesar actually cross the Rubicon? Or did he even have to cross the Rubicon? And that's one of the reasons why that came up, is there's no eyewitness that actually ever happened. It was a friend of a friend of a friend told somebody, and this guy that was a historian wrote it down. Right? And so the question is, did he really actually cross it, or did his army cross it, which is a different thing? And I don't know whether that matters or not, but they're just pointing this out, that because there's no eyewitness testimony, now we have a question as to whether or not this really actually happened.
Why is that significant?
It's not significant. It's just one of those little tiny things that historians bicker over, right? Did Caesar really do this or not? But my point being that there was no eyewitness testimony, and that's where why this has opened up into a thing that people do. And early testimony, something as close as possible to the point and period in time that we're talking about. So if I'm reading something, again, if I'm reading, Ted Koppel's report of JFK's murder, that's a lot different than my report of it in 2016, right? So if somebody who is a historian in the future comes back and looks at it and says, well, Don wrote about it in 2016, but here's a very early news source about it, we're going to look at that source as being more credible than this later source. So these are just these multiple things. Now we're going to show how the evidence that we have for the resurrection fits into these categories, right? Which means that it's much, 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 much more likely to be historically accurate. So just to go over this really quickly again, multiple independent sources. We just want to look at multiple sources, and independent sources, not the same source. What we're talking about that is if I read Gospel of Luke and Acts, both of those are coming from Luke, who is Paul's companion. And so when I read Paul's work and Luke's work, they're not really independent of one another because they were together most of the time, and they were working with each other. But when you read something like the book of John, it is obvious that it is independent of Luke's testimony. It's completely separate from it. And when you read it, you notice that Mark is like completely different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke very much use the same themes, stories, and may even copy from one another. And to who copied from who, that's a debate too. But those stories are very much, and we always call them the synoptic gospels because they're very similar to one another. But you look at John, it's completely out there in left field. It's like it's not following the same conventions. It's not even talking about the same stories. But overall, it's in agreement with the other gospels. And so this is an independent source, obviously, because he's talking about stories that the other ones don't talk about, but still in the same context. Now, so if you ever run into a point where two of these conflict with one another, that's where you have an issue, and you have to figure out why did they conflict with one another. Is it a real confliction or is it not a real confliction? You'll talk about if you any atheist who has read anything about it on the skeptical side, he's probably going to say, well, the gospel accounts are all different about the women when they went to the tomb. And so that causes some people like, oh, wow, Mark says this, but Luke says it this way, and John says it that way, and I don't really know which one's really the truth. The issue is they all can be the truth, and it's just a matter of the way that they wrote it. And so is it a contradiction? And when we look at something to be a contradiction, we're looking for something that cannot be true while the other is true. So when John says it this way and Mark says it this way, or Matthew says it this way, and they both cannot possibly be true, then we have a real contradiction. If he says the women, and this one says 3 women, and this one names 2 women, that doesn't mean 3 women weren't there. This one just named 2 women. When we have a conflict, is if one said there were 3 women and the other one said there was 2 women. We don't have statements like that. It's not a contradiction. It's just one names 2 and the other one says there's 3. Okay, so that's not really a contradiction. Anyways, so we look at stuff like that. So conflicting accounts can confuse things. Sometimes it looks like it's a conflict, really not a conflict. So we just have to kind of look at those very carefully when we do that. However, areas where there's agreement, where there's strong agreement, in other words, they all say the same thing, that's much more likely to be true. If you had 3 eyewitnesses that saw an event happen, a car hit somebody in the parking lot or something like that, and you have 3 people and all 3 of them say it was a red Toyota, and they may differ on other details, the police are going to say it was a red Toyota that did it. Right? I mean, that's kind of... So areas of agreement are very strong for this.
Excluding a conspiracy.
Excluding a conspiracy, yes. Right. Enemy attestation. So this is any time that we have somebody who is not sympathetic to the cause who indicates that something happens. Because they don't have, he says they don't have a bias, but they have a bias. They have a bias against. Right? So if I have a bias against Jesus and I say that Jesus said these things, it's much more likely to be true. Because why would I say it? Right? Especially if it's in agreement with the other ones. Now I may say something that Jesus did that's not in agreement with everybody else that I say to make him look bad. But then that's my bias showing, right? So.
Is there any attestation on the resurrection? Any attestation?
Yeah, we'll take a look at some of those things. We're going to look at specific sources, and most of those sources are referencing that this is what Christians believed. Not that they witnessed it, but this is what Christians were teaching at an early time. So what you'll have is that you will have enemy attestation. Like the fact that the body was missing. The Jewish Pharisees made the story up that the Gospels, that the apostles had stolen the body. This is enemy attestation saying that their agreement that the body was missing.
By that, I'm thinking that is there any written indication that the Jews believed that the body was stolen, independent of the...
Yeah, we'll take a look at those. I'd have to look at... We're going to look at all the ones that we have. There's 5 or 6 different sources. They're not the greatest sources because they're later, 100 years later or something like that. But there's comments in some of the Jewish writings at the time. There's a few. Not a whole lot to hang our hat on, but enough to say that the Gospels are probably accurate because we have this other one that has a vested interest against it, yet they reference it.
Yeah.
So we'll take a look at those. Embarrassing omissions. Again, not taking out those types of things. Are they including those embarrassing facts? The fact that the early church was bickering over circumcision, that's kind of an embarrassing fact. And if I was writing a story about a religion that I was making up, I would say that we were all in 100% agreement at the time, right? All the 12 apostles, we all got together and we all agreed on this. This is why it must be true. But yet the Gospel of Acts says, hey, there was this tension here about this circumcision and how much of the Old Testament law do we follow and how much do we not follow? And you have Paul and Peter kind of at each other about it. They get together, they talk about it, they come to an agreement, and they leave. That's kind of an embarrassing thing to talk about, right? This is an example of something that's embarrassing because if you're trying to create a new religion and you want everybody to buy on it, you want to make sure it's 100% agreement because if you tell them this story, then some people say, well, I agree with Peter, and the other person say, well, I agree with Paul, and now you have all of a sudden you have a schism right off the bat, right when you start a new religion, right? It doesn't make sense if I was making up a story that I would make something like that up. So again, something that's embarrassing. Or Peter, denying Christ. If Peter's writing the story about Jesus Christ, you'd think he would kind of like downplay that. You know what I mean? And in Mark, it kind of is a little downplayed. I mean, it's a little bit more prevalent in Mark, Matthew and Luke type of thing. And it's a little bit less, but it's not absent. It's there. So that's interesting when you look at those types of things. So embarrassing facts are kept into there. Eyewitness testimony. secondhand accounts just don't always have the same level of credibility as you do with an eyewitness, right? So if Don was the guy that saw the accident, saw that it was a red Toyota, and then I come along and I say, well, I heard that it was a blue truck, well, which one are you going to believe? Probably Don, because he was an eyewitness. He's the one that saw it. I just heard someone else told me that it was this. And I'm sure and this is, well, the funny thing is,
The guy that told you that, was he driving the red Toyota?
was he was the one driving the red Toyota. If you think about that, I mean, a lot of gossip starts that way. It's like, I heard that this happened, or so-and-so did this, and without the confirmation of whether that actually happened or what the situation was. And so we all know that secondhand information can be bad to look at. Now, when we look at early testimony, again, historically speaking, we want testimony that's as early as possible. Like, we don't want something that was written 400 years after the fact. Now, what's interesting about this is there's a scholar out there. He's a liberal scholar, and he doesn't believe that Jesus Christ is God. His name's Bart Ehrman. And if you've ever heard of him, you'll know why we laugh. But so he's hyper skeptical. He doesn't believe this. But in his latest book, he makes two claims that he says he's unbiased, which he's not really unbiased because he doesn't believe in miracles, and so that's why he discounts everything. That's the reason he gives. But when you look at what he says in his latest book, he says two things are very interesting. One is that the idea that Jesus was God was a very, very early Christian tradition. How early does he think? Within the first decade. This is huge because a lot of other scholars that try to be hyper-skeptical, like somebody like Richard Carrier, who says Jesus never existed, he thinks that this was all invented at a later date. This is evidence completely against that. And that the 1 Corinthians 15, there's a little passage in there that we'll look at in here where Paul says, I taught to you of first importance that Jesus died and was rose again, da-da-da-da. That is considered what we call a creedal passage. In other words, it's written in such a way that it has, in the original tongue, was probably kind of poetic or rhythmic, which is what people would have done in the past to remember things, like the lyrics of a song type of thing, some repeated in such a way that it's easy to remember. That account was written within, or wasn't written within, but was the creed that was given within 2 to 3 years of the time of Christ, of the resurrection. So within 2 to 3 years, they said that he rose from the dead. And this is a skeptical scholar that doesn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but then says that, in fact, that was the major Christian belief, that was the creedal statement that they had within 2 years of the event. So this is huge. This means that he says, that there's some level of certainty that, that this happened within 2 to 3 years of that. That is... And it's a huge admission by somebody who is typically on that side, the liberal side of interpretation, to say that that is something that is that early. In fact, that blows a lot of other scholars' work out of the thing because they want to say, it was 100 years later where Christians believe this. They want to say the Gospels were written, 200 AD or something like that. And evidence keeps on showing it's earlier and earlier and earlier. Currently, I think our earliest copy of the Gospel of John was dated at 90 AD. And so most scholars say, well, this is the earliest copy we have, so we're going to say that the Gospel of John was written in 90 AD. But if you read it in context, if you read John, you almost want to say that John was written before the destruction of the temple, before 70 AD, which means the other Gospels were well before that. Now, and to look at what they're saying, they're just saying that it's certain that it had to be 90 AD or earlier. And scholars, typically if you read the scholarly work, they say, well, we have a piece of papyrus from 90 AD, therefore we're going to say it's 90 AD. Well, if it's 90 AD and that's the one you have, then you're saying that that's the autograph, that's the original copy. Right? So that gives a lot of credibility to what it says. But anyways, but they don't do that, right? They're assuming that that is not a copy of a copy of a copy that was the earliest one, right? So when they say it's 90 AD, that's all they're saying. So it may actually even be a lot earlier. So this year coming out, and they've been taking a long time to do this. They're still working on it. They have a piece of papyrus from the Gospel of Mark that actually goes back early into the 1st century. So they're saying that this is a copy of the book of Mark from like 60 or 50 AD, which is going to, if true, rock the academic world, because now it's going to say, well, the Bible scholars have been right all along. These things are early, right? So we're having early testimony, and every time we find new manuscripts and stuff like that, it's pushing back the Gospels earlier and earlier and earlier to what the Gospels, if you just take them on face value, what they say they are. So that's a good thing in our favor, and that's something that we should remember. So if you're talking to somebody who's telling you, oh, the Gospels are made up, they're a late invention, well, you can say, well, no, they're not late invention, because we know that at least the Gospel of John, which was the latest one written, we know that at the very latest it would have to have been written at 90 AD. But it's more likely earlier than that, right? And so we just keep on pushing away that, because their skepticism is based upon something they heard somewhere else, probably old scholarship before we even had that piece of manuscript and stuff like that. And by the way, you can go and look at some of these manuscripts. There is it's out of Dallas Seminary, and Dan Wallace is actually taking pictures of all of the original manuscripts and then posting them online for free. So if you want to see the earliest Codex Alexandrinus and you want to see it, you can go look at it. You can look at the original source yourself. You don't a photocopy of the original. Well, you have to take a Greek class. But if you take that Greek class, then you'll be able to read it. And so that's kind of an exciting thing today, because we're now starting to use the technology to say, okay, you want the evidence? Here it is. Here's this earliest copy of John that we have, and here's the photocopy of it. You can argue about it, but there it is. Scholars have looked at it. This is what they've dated it to. Now what are you going to do? So the important thing today is, what happens today when some incident happens? Nobody listens to what anybody says. They just want to know, did somebody get the video on their cell phone, right? Right? That's what everybody's looking for. Where's the cell phone video? Because everybody now has a camcorder with them, which, 30 years ago you didn't have a camcorder with you. 10 years ago you probably didn't have a camcorder with you. But now I have a camcorder with me, with this phone, and anything goes down, rather than help, I just have to record it for historical sake. I can just go like this and, capture the whole event, whatever is happening. So we have a tendency that we will go and jump on and see if there's any video, and we'll say, oh, that definitely happened because I can see the video. There's an interesting thing about this is historians don't have that type of access, right? We don't have a video of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, or him being murdered, or any of that kind of stuff. Do we not think that happened? No, we think it happened. We have no reason to doubt that it happened. But we've gotten so dependent upon someone taking a video of something that we forgot that until recently that wasn't possible. The second thing is that people actually put a lot of weight onto something like this, more than they should. Because what the video doesn't show you is what happened just before that or what happened after that. So what led up to this event that this person was recording? And so oftentimes what will happen is some police officer involved shooting will happen. Someone will get the thing where the shooting happens, and that's the only clip that you will see on the news. The news isn't going to show you everything that led up to whatever that was. I'm not justifying what they did. I'm just saying that we can't take this as evidence of that, right? Because now, and you'll find out if you watch some of those videos, people will start talking, well, that person was trying to do this. Really, the person did that. I don't know what was going on in their mind, so how am I even reading? Video doesn't read their mind, so how am I saying that they intended X? I don't know what they intended, right? Because we're not inside their brain. I can see what they did, and whether that lines up with what they say they intended or not, that's a separate issue. But we have an issue today where people are more willing to just jump on a video that they see out of context and just say, oh, this is the God honest truth, and they forget all the other stuff related to it. So this mentality of we have to have video of it is false, because we believe a lot of things happened in the past without video testimony. And we even know that video testimony isn't the best type of testimony because we don't know what happened before or after. We also don't know if anyone ever messed with it, right?
The assumption that it's pure video, and if you watch television, you know most of what you watch is not.
Right.
It's been massaged one way or another. And the
Right.
lovely people that they are more concerned about sensationalization.
Right. So it's just,
it all gets messed up. I mean,
yeah. And we just have to be critical about the things that we see. Even if we see it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. There's one video out there, I don't know what it is, and because I watched it a long time ago, and it's another one of those cop-related shootings. But what they don't show in the video that everybody saw was that this guy had a gun in his back, right? So the video shows the perpetrator in his back, and he has a gun right there clearly. And the video that you see is he's reaching around like this, and then the cop shoots him. That's the only thing that everybody saw. Everybody thought, oh, the cop was definitely wrong, and he was shooting him because it was a racial type of thing. So you never saw the part where he was reaching for the gun, or that he had a gun in his back waistband. Right? So again, this is why it's vitally important that you know what happened before and after. You don't rush to conclusions. Right? So people all rush to a conclusion that this was the case. Then when the full video came out, the case kind of died out. Right? So in these other instances where stuff has happened, who knows? Although I added funny thing, and this is kind of related to apologetics, and so it is a little bit of a sidebar. But the event that happened in Charleston, where the guy came in and shot everybody, right? The white guy who shot all the African American people in church. Did you see how that town reacted to obvious racial injustice? Did they riot?
it was truly amazing. It was.
They didn't riot. What did the members of the church that had their loved ones that were killed that day? One of them came up and forgave the guy. Posted it on Facebook. It was a sensation for a day and a half. Everybody forgot about it. So this kid had a video of him ranting about racial things, and he had the Confederate flag behind him when he was doing it. So what has the news turned everything towards? The flag. What are we missing about this whole entire episode? The church's response and the city's response in a positive manner to something that was wrong and unjust was forgiveness. That the rest of the world probably thinks is crazy. Like, how can you possibly forgive someone who killed your loved one? I mean, that truly takes the Holy Spirit. It really does. Evidence of his existence, I would say.
And how can something that was so racially motivated result in racial harmony rather than people starting
Exactly.
against each other?
Exactly.
Pardon?
Immediately.
Yeah, right away. Church
Yes.
came to the rescue.
One of the big differences too is that the responsible wasn't a cop.
Right. But it's still racial. And I would have thought that they would have been incensed that another white person's killing another black person, because that's the way they're going to look at it. And then there would have been riots all over the town and all this stuff. That's not the response we got. If that had happened in Oakland, what would we have had? We probably would have had a riot. There's a huge difference that we have. Because they would have just said, it's not just the cops, it's also these crazy white people. It's not just the cops we can't trust, it's the other white people we can't trust. That's what they would say.
But another big difference is that the people of Charleston came out immediately, and there was no time for, in Oakland, half of the people that were marching and protesting don't even live in Oakland. They're not even from the area. And that's true of other places where that has happened. They come from the outside. It's organized protesting to disrupt, to loot, to burn, and to essentially help destroy the stability of the community.
But I
We
think,
didn't have time in this
yeah,
situation.
I think in this situation, though, you have the church being the first to respond.
Right away.
And
So there was no
and it,
room for
yeah,
dissension.
and it's no. Yes, it's in the South, but it's also not a unknown fact that most people know that people in the South are a bit more religious than people in California, right?
About that situation, a huge part of that situation, the members of this church, they didn't just come out and say we forgive. They refused to let the press make this into something that And they continued that narrative, and they kept telling the brethren, no, you're not turning this into something it's not.
Right.
And that was the Christianity coming out and standing up for the gospel and the Holy Spirit. They told them, no, this is not what you're going to do. This is what happened, and this is the way we feel. I know I read an article. I asked somebody, did forgive? Yes, I forgive. But yeah, but aren't you still really angry about all this? I tell you, I forgave first. And that's where that's all I'm going to tell you about it. If I have anger, I'm not going to tell you about that.
Yeah, the interesting thing is,
The Christians hung in there, which we don't tend to do too much.
yeah. Yeah.
Saying turning hate into love, they repeat that.
Yeah, that is something that I think we all can learn from. Every church in the United States could learn from their response to it. And I think it's telling that the media turned this into the rebel flag is the issue. You notice that? I mean, I don't know if you all noticed that, but that all of a sudden that's what it's all about. This rebel flag, the flag, and it was all related to the fact that this kid had done this video with that flag in the video, and now this is why everybody's incensed. And they had people come in from outside to complain about the flag.
And Obama's speech.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So, yes, they definitely use it for us. But from an apologetic standpoint, I mean, what that church did is they perfectly witnessed the gospel. What is a good example of that? So as the witness part of it, they did a great job on it. Unfortunately, the media kind of tried to twist it all around. But not before that got out there. People remember that. And kind of our job as the rest of the church is to keep on focusing in on what they were focusing in on. When people start talking about the flag, saying, yeah, the flag's an issue, but let's go back to why we were even talking about this. The incident that happened in Charleston. How did they respond? What was this about? Really, because what they're trying to do is control the way the debate goes. And if they can control the way the debate goes away from the central issue, somebody killed a bunch of people and those people forgave them. That's the central issue to me. Like, which for the world's point of view is like, how do they even understand it? If I was not a Christian, I'd be like, how do these Christians, why would they be forgiving? Why aren't they out in the streets rioting like everybody else does? That would be my question. So that would be, to me, I would say, there's something different about them. I don't know what it is, but there's something definitely different. And that's a powerful witness for us. So anyways, that's my little side thing. But
Great contrast would be if somebody had gone into a gang house and shot 9 members of a gang. What would have been the result from that? It would have been warfare on the streets.
oh yeah,
Gangs killing gangs and something like that.
yeah,
So the response was much different, and because of who was involved,
right,
what people are, what they believed in.
yeah, definitely. So it's a dark point in U.S. history, but I think it's also a bright spot too, and that's something that I think that we would probably want to continue to.
Unfortunately, a big part of the battle is the press, because the press is not going to report on anything that isn't sensationalized and is going to get everybody's attention. And violence and anger and hate are things that people latch onto. And forgiveness is something so foreign that they don't understand it, and it's not a news story.
Right.
It's sad, but
Well, you would think it would, because Oprah loves sappy things like that, right?
yeah, but then
But-
Oprah also
But that's not news,
what she
right?
believes
Yeah.
Right.
would not support that Christian thought, so it isn't going to make its way to Oprah.
Yeah. So, anyways, back to our point of the resurrection. I did say it was a sidebar, but it was a good sidebar, I think. I think it's good to look at these types of things, because I think we have to look at culture as a whole and how culture is responding to things. As Christians, we have to know what the worldview is out there and how we respond to it. We're talking specifically, yeah. And specifically, we're going to talk about the resurrection, obviously, in this class. But so what kind of criteria should we have for the facts that we plan to use to support the resurrection? So after I just told you this, and I'm going to make a case to a non-believer, what types of facts am I looking for to give them? So if we go back to those criteria I have, those are the types of things I want to use as my evidence, because that is the strongest historical evidence I have from a secular historian's point of view. So that's what I want to do, because my audience. You ever notice? I was listening to this audiobook, or not audiobook, it's an audio course about how to write better, And the lady was talking about, you always have to know your audience. You have to write to your audience. Don't write to yourself or your friend. Write to who you want to write to. And so if I want to write to an atheist, I need to go at his level, right? If I want to write something to teenagers, I'm not going to write it at the level that I have to write a college paper for, where I have to use the big $2 words and all that kind of stuff, because they're not going to get it, right? So I have to tailor how I approach. So we're tailoring this towards skeptics. So what do I want to do? The two criteria that he talks about in there is the two things he wants to do. He wants to do that it's well evidenced. In other words, there's multiple attestation. It's early. It has embarrassing facts to it. All those types of things that we talked about, that it's that type of evidence. The second thing we want to do is that nearly every scholar accepts it, right? So even the liberal ones, if they accept these facts or this piece of evidence in history, those are the ones I want to use. Because then we're not quibbling over, scholars don't believe that. Well, no, most of them do. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the whole Gospels. I'm not talking about Jesus walking on the water. Because again, my audience is the skeptical person, right? I just want to talk about the things that they all agree on. Let's talk about what they agree on. And where they don't agree, we can look at those types of things. But let's just talk about that kind of stuff. And including those skeptical ones like Bart Ehrman and those types of folks. So if we look at those types of evidence that they all accept, the scholars, then we can go back in and say, okay, these are the facts that we have. What's the best explanation for those facts? That's what we want to get. That's where we're trying to get to.
With the results, or how has affected mankind fit in there somewhere?
How is what?
How has affected mankind, and specifically, I'm talking about resurrection.
Yes. That'll be one of the issues, because we'll talk about, because he comes up with the next, I'll get into the next slide because it kind of segues into it. The next thing is what he calls the minimal facts approach. He's not trying to prove that the Gospel of John is true and the Gospel of Matthew is true and the Gospel of Mark is true and so on. He's just going to say, I'm going to take the facts that are in those that are attested by most scholars. So he's not talking about the miracles of Jesus walking on water or feeding 5,000, because there's a lot of skeptical scholars that say that never happened, right? We're not going to talk about that. And interestingly enough, some people say, because the Gospel of Matthew says that Jesus walked on water or whatever, I can't accept the whole entire book. Well, if you did that, then most early histories back then you'd have to throw out too. Because a lot of the early historians like Suetonius and those types of people talk about miracles happening too. What do most historians do when they read those? They just read past them but they don't discount the whole entire book as being fraudulent because of those accounts. So we're just asking them to do the same thing towards the Gospels. So this minimal facts approach is to seek to use the evidence with the highest degree of certainty. So I just want to take evidence that has the highest level of certainty. And it only considers those that are so strongly attested historically that they are granted by almost every scholar. There's so much evidence that most scholars just accept these. Those are the ones I want to use. I think that we can make a case, and this is what he'll say, we can make a case with this. So, again, we're trying to build a strong, simple case. I don't want to have to argue 15 different points. That's not a simple case. I want to be able to just, especially if I'm talking to a skeptic, I'm not going to have 5 hours to go through all of this stuff that we talk about in this class. So I have to have a very short, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it type of speech that we're going to have. So we want to build our case on 4 facts plus 1. So there's 5 facts, but also I'll show you why he kind of divides them up into 4 plus 1. The first 4 facts are backed by enough evidence that skeptical scholars will agree on them. So all the skeptical scholars will agree on these 4 facts. Okay, so we'll start with that as our basis. And then the last one is a majority of scholars agree with it, not all of them. Okay, so there we go. We got our 5 facts, and a majority or all scholars will agree with these things. Right? So that's what we kind of want to do. And one of those things is like the changing of the lives of the apostles. That'll be one of the things that we will talk about when we look at the evidence. We'll say, hey, but what's more likely, this or this? But look at the changed lives that they had. So that'll be part of it, and that's where that comes in, what you were talking about, right? So how will the skeptical non-believer view the Bible? Again, I'm writing towards my audience, or I'm talking to my audience. How do they view the Bible? Right? So that's going to be one of our questions. Obviously, one of our main sources is going to be the Bible for this. While we hold that the Bible is trustworthy and inspired, we cannot expect the non-believer to whom we're dialoguing with to embrace the same review that we have, that they think that it's inspired or they think that. I see a lot of well-meaning Christians say, Book of John says this, and then that's their evidence, and that's all they give. Unfortunately, that's not enough for a skeptical, because the skeptical person is going to say, well, that's not, I don't believe it's inspired, so good that it says it, whoopee. We haven't made any ground. Then we talk about, like Paul talks about evidence, and when he talks to his different audiences, and he changes the way he talks when depending upon his audience. So if you want some good homework, go through the book of Acts again, and look at how Paul addresses each individual audience, and how and when he uses Scripture when he's making those cases. It's very interesting, very telling. And I think that Paul's example is a good example for us to use as well. So when we look at that kind of stuff, we can't assume that they believe the Bible. When he's at Mars Hill, does he even bring up the Bible? He never even mentions Scripture in there. In fact, he quotes secular philosophers when he's making his case, because he knows his audience and he's talking to his audience. Does that mean that Paul didn't think that the Old Testament was inspired? No, he absolutely did think it was inspired. He knew that they didn't think it was, and so it wasn't one of his points that he was trying to push. Because then you would have to justify the inspiration of the Bible, and then that becomes a big long, you have to justify these things. So let's not have to justify these things. Let's take what scholars agree upon and go from there. That's what he's doing. And that's kind of what we're talking about doing here. So how do historians recognize in most writings of antiquity that most of them contain factual errors, and most of their writings also contain what we call propaganda? In other words, when they're reading something about the story of Julius Caesar, they realize that there are facts in there, and they realize that there's propaganda. So when historians read things in the ancient world, that's kind of how they look at everything. The one thing that they always seem to change on is the Bible, and they just want to either accept it or not accept it as a whole, rather than looking at the individual parts. But every other work, they will look at each of the individual parts of it and say, is this being propaganda or is this actual factual? Let's look at other historians' accounts and see what we can find is factual, and then we can discount the rest as propaganda. That's how they normally do it. We're saying that if they do the same thing with the Bible, that they will come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ did raise from the dead. Resurrection is true. And then that becomes our leaping point of saying, if Jesus Christ said he was going to raise from the dead, did raise from the dead, it authenticates the rest of what he said. That's kind of like the approach, right? So skeptics, they may want to address alleged Bible contradictions. And most historians recognize in antiquity there are factual areas and propaganda in it. So for them to point that out, it's not a big deal. But the minimal fact approach is not going to address any of those contradictions. We stay away from the contradictions. We're just going to focus on what we know with a high level of certainty, historical certainty. Only those items. So the 5 items we're going to talk about are not any of these contradictions. And we can prove our case without using any of that. We can then go back to those things and address them after we've established the resurrection happened. And we can show that they're really not contradictions. But that's a separate issue. Try to avoid getting off into that. Like they want to talk about the women in there. Say, look, let's just talk about what scholars all agree actually happened with a high degree of certainty. Let's focus on those things and let's bring it out. Let's talk about those things. Because once we establish that, it answers all those other questions. So then we're showing also that the Bible is trustworthy when we do that as well. Can we expect a non-believer to embrace the view that the Bible is trustworthy and inspired right off the bat? Obviously not. We hold it, but we can't expect them to do it. It's kind of like what if they bring up contradictions? We can go on endlessly about those things. This is kind of our trump card that gets rid of those problems of the contradictions. Once we establish the resurrection, we authenticate who Jesus Christ is and that what he said is true. He authenticates the rest of Scripture, including the Old Testament, because he says the Old Testament's true. Now, if he died and didn't raise from the dead, would I really care that he said that the Old Testament is true? Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But now that he's died and rose again from the dead, and he said that the Old Testament they had at that time was true, that Daniel was written before him, whatever, and he authenticates it. Some people want to say, oh, Daniel was written later and all this kind of stuff because it has a lot of prophecy that nobody hundreds of years earlier could have known. So they say Daniel must have been written later. Well, if we prove that Jesus Christ is who he says he was, well, then he authenticates that it was written earlier, even though we have copies from earlier. Anyways, which is a whole different story. So what we're doing is we're keeping the main thing the main thing. We don't want to get off in the weeds in the bush. Let's just stay right down the center. So, because otherwise they will just try to throw up all these other things and say, look, I'm going to make a case for 5 points. We'll talk about those 5 points. You show me where any of those 5 points or scholars agree that this isn't true, and then we can talk about those things, which I won't be able to find any. But anyways, because we're using what most scholars agree with. And we're not going to talk about those other things. And they say, well, is it most likely to be true or not? And they're going to be stuck. They're going to have to try and hem and haw and say, no, we're not talking about all those other things. Let's just stick with these things. Because you will find they will try to go off in every different direction because they don't want to face the implications of this. Which if you read Romans 1 again, it's them trying to avoid the implications of what they know is to be true. So it's essential. It's also essential if we want to talk about the inspirationcy or inerrancy of Scripture, right? Because this becomes the authentication of it, God's seal on the Bible. So we want to make sure that we prove this out first. So what about mythicists? So mythicists, a fancy word for people that say Jesus never existed. He's a complete and total myth. Now, Bart Ehrman actually, Bart Ehrman, who is, again, he's a liberal scholar, not on our side, but it's funny when he talks about Richard Carrier, or David Fitzgerald's the other guy. Oh, it's not on the next one. That they believe that he didn't exist, there's no historical evidence or whatever. They are not historians, and they are not taking it as historians would take these documents. They're just kind of throwing this out there because they recognize the weakness of the historians. They recognize, because Christians have said, hey, this is what the case is, and the only other way that they can escape the conclusions of the 5 points that we're going to make is to say it's all made up. That's the only way they can avoid it. So that's what a lot of them are starting to do. 50 years ago, nobody ever thought that Jesus, it was a complete and total myth. That was not a thing that scholars had on their, highlights or whatever. Another guy who also wrote, Oslin, I think is his name, and he wrote something very similar to, basically, this is all a bunch of myths and stuff like that. Funny thing is, he wrote a book. Everyone really liked it because, this guy, he's a really good writer. He's a really good writer, but do you know what he teaches? Fictional writing. He teaches fictional writing for like UCLA or one of the colleges down in Southern California. He writes a book about why he doesn't believe the resurrection. It's really interesting and really kind of telling that if you're not a scholar, a biblical scholar, you can't get a job as a biblical scholar, so you get a job writing fiction, and then you write a story about why you don't think the Bible's true or Jesus didn't raise from the dead or whatever. It's kind of, I don't know. It's just something that you kind of have to say, huh. Not to discount his things just because he is those things, but when the rest of the scholars say, do we agree on these facts? And he comes out of left field teaching something like that and says that he disagrees with those scholars, you have to wonder about it. So again, even the skeptical ones grant that most of that these are true. So of course there are those that deny the hyperskepticism, like Richard Carrier, David Fitzgerald. So if you ever run across them, they're the ones that disagree with it. However, they are the minority. By minority, I mean like there's a handful of these people that we can talk about. There's not a whole bunch of them. And again, scholars, even skeptical ones like Bart Ehrman, think that these guys are crazy and nuts. So he doesn't agree with us, but he thinks that these people are crazy and nuts because he says they don't understand. There's a really good, what's the name of the show? I should kind of find it. It's 15 minutes long, but it's a radio call-in show type of thing, and I think they do a podcast. It's called the not heathen, but what's the infidel? Something about the infidel show or something like that. And he's basically an atheist, and he just takes pot shots at all religions, and he's always taking pot shots at Christian. So he heard that Bart Ehrman doesn't believe the resurrection happened. So he gets him in here, and he starts saying, hey, we're great guys. We all believe the same thing. It's all made up, right? He's like, it's all made up hundreds of years later, all this kind of thing. He's basically taking Richard Carrier's point of view. And Bart Ehrman's like, no, that's not true at all. Jesus Christ was a historical person. He definitely existed. And he said, and then he started, trying to, the host was trying to, make some of the arguments that Richard Carrier makes and all this kind of stuff. And he says, no, these people don't know what they're talking about. They're not even scholars in this area. They have no right to, they don't know what they're talking about. And he just cuts them. He just cuts them bad. And I thought, and if you know Bart Ehrman, what is so dangerous about him in particular is he's very good with how he words things, and he's very good about like making the other opponent look like they're crazy or whatever it is, even if it's us, right? So he did an excellent job on this, and of course I really appreciate that he did it for this other guy. But I mean, he just lambasted him and just basically said, look, this is just silly. He almost said, like, why am I on this show? Because you guys are obviously not intellectuals. You guys are a bunch of, you just buy whatever someone's selling you, type of thing. So it was really interesting for him to come out so strongly against this other position, which is the hyper-skeptical position, to the point that they say Jesus never existed. He just lambasts them.
Do you have access to that?
Yeah, it's actually on YouTube. If you look up Infidel and Richard Carrier discussion or something, I'll find it and then I'll post it so you guys can have. I've posted before in the past, but it's a great, again, where he just talks about the evidence and said, no, you're just absolutely crazy, right? Even though he doesn't agree with us, he agrees with a number of these facts, like the early witness to it and all that other stuff. He doesn't. I think what he currently believes is that Jesus was never buried. That's why there was an empty tomb. So he agrees there's an empty tomb.
Yeah.
His way around it is, well, Jesus never made it to the tomb. That's what he's trying to say. And he's a very weak thing. He uses that other guy that we talked about a couple weeks ago, who was from the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan. John Dominic Crossan says that ancient Romans would typically leave people up on the cross, and then they, after they've been up there for days, they would take them down and throw them into a pile, and then dogs would usually come and take the bodies away. So he says the dogs went and ate the body of Jesus. That's what happened to it. That's his opinion. He cites some sources in ancient Rome, some historians, other things, to say that they did this in other places and at other times. Then, what's his name? Bart Ehrman goes and basically tells the same story, talks about a couple of the evidences. He leaves some out, which he probably was a good idea. He left some of them out, because two of the sources that John Dominic Crossan had referenced as evidence are fictional stories. Now think about this. 100 years from now, someone's writing the history of what happened here in the United States, and someone references the movie Spider-Man as evidence that this is what Americans do on a normal basis. We would all kind of look at them and say, yeah, that's fiction. Why would you even reference that? Right? So Bart Ehrman leaves those out, which I thought was really good. But he left out another key piece of evidence, probably the smoking gun, that he had to leave out because he has no justification for it. Most of the other, there's two other cases that they talk about. One of them, both of them are about people that tried to kill the king, or the Caesar, the emperor. Two people tried to kill him, and what was their execution? They were Roman citizens, and Roman citizens usually were never ever crucified. That was the one thing you knew. If you're a Roman citizen, you would get a fast beheading. You wouldn't get crucified where it's long and drawn out and thing. These people had tried to kill Caesar, had a plot to kill Caesar. When they got found out, they were crucified. They were left up. They were denied a burial, because that's the Romans would normally do that, apparently for other cultures as well. And then they would take and just throw the bodies in a heap. And that's what happened to these people. Difference here is both of those were extreme examples where it was regicide. Somebody was trying to kill the emperor, and the emperor said, no, I'm going to make an example of them, an extreme example of them. So to say that those two examples that were hundreds of years apart from when Jesus happened, to say that this is what happened to Jesus is a little stretch. There's a couple other examples where they talk about it. One is a crucifixion like in France or in Gaul or someplace like that. Not the Middle East. Over there. You also have to then assume if it happened in Gaul 100 years before, 100 years after, that it's also happening in Palestine at that period in time. Again, that's a big stretch. If I told you that the sexual morals of the United States today are X, and I said it's been throughout, 200 years ago also when the Puritans were in charge of the United States, it was the same sexual morals, you'd probably say, no. A lot has changed in a couple hundred years. So same thing here. I don't know that you can take this event that happened over here and apply it to Jesus Christ and say that it happened to him. Okay.
Not only that, but wasn't he ever really Jewish jurisdiction?
Yes. So here, yes. So,
Romans crucified him, but it was the request of the...
so here's the thing. Those evidences all kind of point towards the idea that the Romans would crucify people, leave them on the cross, and then throw them in a pile. Okay, great. Now, what evidence do we have from the time of Jesus in Palestine? Josephus. Josephus gives us some information. Not just about two people that were crucified that were taken down and actually survived. One of them died later, but the other one apparently had a regular life after, not necessarily a regular life, but a longer life. So things were a little bit different in Israel, but he also says that the normative way that crucifixions happened in there, not talking about Jesus' crucifixion, but talking about the other crucifixions that they were doing in Israel at the time, was that they would crucify somebody, and before sundown, the Jewish authorities would take the body off and give it a proper burial, because it was offensive to the Jews to leave it up. The Romans didn't want to offend the Jews, because last time they offended them, it turned it into a big, huge outbreak. So the Romans had to deal with and this is why Pontius Pilate was always kind of like on his edge there, because he also had done some things that kind of got Caesar mad at him, because it created a rebellion. Rome doesn't want rebellion. They want people to shut up and live their lives and just pay their taxes, right? That's what Rome wants. They don't want rebellions, and they don't want to have to send troops there to fight the rebellions, because they got them going on all over the empire. They have a very large empire, so they will appease those people. Josephus says one of the ways that they did this is when they crucified someone, they took them down, gave them a proper burial. Bart Ehrman does not reference that. It seems like that's a key and important fact to whether or not Jesus was buried or not. Now wait, this isn't even yet. There's more. For 1995, I will tell you the rest. No, just kidding. We have archaeological evidence that the Jews did bury crucified people. We have all kinds of bones found properly buried in Israel that have marks of crucifixion. We have one that still has the nail stuck in it. So we have archaeological evidence that supports what Josephus says. Now, there's two things with this. Bart Ehrman, who has got a PhD in the study of this particular, New Testament, doesn't know this fact or doesn't disclose this fact. There's only two choices. He knows it and he doesn't say it in his book. And what do we call that?
Liar.
Deception. Dishonest, deception, right? As a scholar, he should point these things out. The second one, what is the second thing? If he's not lying to us, then he doesn't know. Then he really needs to get a refund on his PhD. Because how could he not know that? I know he's read Josephus, because he talks about it in the other books. He just forget this one? He could say he forgot it, but he obviously read John Dominic Crossan, who also referenced this work and didn't know how to deal with it. He just kind of threw it out there, well, this is out there, and he just kind of went on talking about other things. Really didn't address it. He just said, Josephus says this, goes on to the next item. That's like the most important one, because this one is not happening to someone trying to kill Caesar. It's not from a fictional account. It's not from someplace else at a different time in the Roman Empire. It is from the time and place of what we're discussing here for what we're talking about. This is huge.
Doesn't Ehrman reference Josephus for proof of the historical Jesus?
Does who? Doesn't
Ehrman reference
Yes.
Josephus for
Yeah.
proof that there is a...
Yeah, he talks at length about one of the passages in there.
Something we know about.
Exactly. I don't want to come out and say that he's being dishonest, because, again, a scholar wouldn't say the other guy's dishonest. I'm saying, logically, we have two choices.
Yeah.
He doesn't know, or he's dishonest. If he doesn't know, then I question his scholastic ability on everything else that he writes, because this one seems to be the most important piece of facts to this issue. And the second one is, well, if he's dishonest, then, well,
Write him a letter.
write him a letter.
You now have a new degree.
Right. Well, but mine's only got an MA after, not a PhD. I don't have 3 letters yet.
Isn't he also a scholar on the Old Testament?
Huh?
And isn't he a scholar on the Old Testament?
New Testament. He's a New Testament scholar.
Only, not Old Testament?
No, he knows the stuff about the Old Testament. He's not a scholar on the Old Testament.
I got the impression he knows Jewish tradition and history.
He does. He knows.
Well.
He knows scholarly term Second Temple Judaism. From the time that the Second Temple was finished until it was destroyed, which includes the New Testament at the latter end of that period of Jewish history, scholars all pay attention because that explains what you're reading in the New Testament, because this is what the Pharisees and Sadducees believed and thought, and you need to understand that to really get the full grasp of what the gospel is saying, because Jesus is talking to Sadducees and Pharisees, and he talks to them differently. If you don't know how they're different, you won't notice those subtleties. So he studied what's called Second Temple Judaism. So his study doesn't go beyond that back to the Solomon period of time or the First Temple Judaism or pre-Judaism or what I call proto-Judaism, which is prior to Moses. Those types of different areas and the different ways that Jews looked at things wasn't always the same throughout history. And so he focused in on that area. So it does seem like he's a Old Testament scholar, but it's really just a very sliver of the Old Testament that's necessary to understand the New Testament. So yes, he's a New Testament scholar, but kind of not all the way there. So anyways, so that's your new little thing. And I wrote that up somewhere, and I think I may even, I don't know if I've actually put it into a blog post yet or not like that, but because that's a very important point, right? We'll talk about that later, about Jesus being actually buried and why that's an important thing to know, because otherwise an empty tomb, if he was never buried, of course there's an empty tomb, right? So we kind of want to know that it happened. And again, Josephus is the smoking gun that answers the question definitively. And we could say, well, I don't believe in Josephus. Well, great. I've got all kinds of historical, archaeological evidence that supports what he says. That's a very, very strong case. We have the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels. We have Josephus, who was not a Christian, who tests to that this is the way that the Jews handled these things in the day. And then we have archaeological evidence that backs that up. Out of everything in the ancient world that we know with any level of certainty, it is certain that he was buried. It's beyond ridiculous to claim that it wasn't. I mean, we don't have that level of facts for everything else in history. I mean, this is huge. That's what and so now I've kind of given you a taste of what the rest of this book is going to be about, because we're going to look at all those individual evidences as we go through. But this is giving you a taste of how powerful the evidence is in our favor. And just like Paul would cite facts and evidence, we're going to cite facts and evidence in our case as well. And I think with that, we're done. Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you today for this time together, and we want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn these things. And we ask that you give us the opportunities to also share our faith with others that may have questions in these, and please give us the words and help us to remember these things so that when skeptics ask, we have an answer for them, and help us to do that with gentleness and respect. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
So would you ever say that the Roman guards were guarding an empty tomb, or that there was no guards guarding the tomb?
He doesn't address it at all. He doesn't even bring it up as, because there's all these other types of things that come up. If he wasn't buried, because this is a kind of an important thing, then why did the Pharisees came up with this thing that because the Pharisees tell the guards to tell them to say, hey, tell everybody that we'll make sure that Pontius Pilate doesn't kill you, because what you just did was a capital offense. We'll make sure that doesn't happen to you because we want you to say that they came and stole the body. Okay, so they came and stole the body so that they can make this thing up. It's interesting because the Pharisees recognized that he said that he was going to be raised from the dead, and that that's what the Jews were going to do. I mean, that's what the disciples were going to do, is say that he rose from the dead. So they kind of made up the story. So you'll find in later Jewish traditions, they write that Jesus was buried, stolen out. The body was stolen. So they've maintained that story throughout history, that that's what happened. Barnum doesn't address that either.
Question is, what motivation do you have for stealing the body? Realistic, can you foresee that Christianity would soon?
Well, you think about it, the Bible is very, very realistic to what happened. What was their emotions? They were all dejected. They were hiding. They weren't bold or anything like that. If they stole that body on the third day one after that, I'd be bold and I'd be out there like Peter and Paul later did, but it didn't happen until after Pentecost. Right? If that was my plan to do that all along, I would say, guess what, guys? Jesus rose again from the dead. I would do that on day 4. And I would be bold then. Why would you wait and be cowering and hiding and being afraid of the thing? And you got to think about it. They just crucified that guy who wasn't even inciting a riot. They crucified him. If I'm going to go up and say, no, I'm with that guy, come on. They're going to crucify me. Right? Yeah. Exactly. So it's one of those things. And yes, Peter denied him, and later on, now he's boldly proclaiming him. Huge difference. This is. They had to have seen something fantastic. Otherwise, they would not have done these things. It's ridiculous. And as we look at more of this, and we look at what are the possible explanations for all this, they all kind of fall away. None of them make sense. We're going to end up, by the end of this class, there's going to be one that makes sense. All right. Thank you, guys.